Greetings. You are listening to Understanding Israel-Palestine on KKFI Community Radio, 90.1 FM. Every Friday morning at 9:30 a.m., this show introduces our audience to journalists, scholars, policy analysts, and activists who can help us better understand the realities that now prevail in Israel-Palestine. I am Jamie Jackson, the producer of this week's show, with the assistance of co-hosts Margot Patterson and Jeremy Roth-Kushel. Today we talk with Emad Moussa, a Palestinian British academic. Dr. Moussa holds a PhD in social psychology and an MA in the theory and practice of human rights. He specializes in the political and social psychology of the situation in Israel-Palestine. Today we hear about his experience growing up in Gaza and his eyewitness observations in 2005 of the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Shortly thereafter, he left to study in Great Britain, successfully surmounting the many obstacles that continue to face today's Palestinian youth who want to study abroad, obstacles that have their root in the occupation and Israel's near total control of Palestinians. Emad Moussa, welcome to KKFI and Understanding Israel-Palestine. You were living in Gaza in 2005 when Israeli Prime Minister Sharon withdrew the Jewish settlers from Gaza. As a social psychologist, can you speak to the initial feeling of relief on the part of Gazans when the settlers were gone?
Well, basically, on that August day in 2005, I was amongst a few journalists who went very early in the morning to report what's happening on the border, was Israelis withdrawing from Gaza. For me, it was a bit surreal for many reasons. As a Palestinian, especially my generation and the generations that came after us, it's most Palestinians, I would say 90% of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank were born under the occupation. So there is a difficulty for them to see the world outside this frame of reference. So when Israelis are leaving Gaza, there is a possibility of hope. I wouldn't say hope because you cannot define it exactly as what to expect, what happens after the withdrawal, how the world will be like. And we've been living under occupation all our lives. We don't know what it feels or looks like without occupation. We have a theoretical knowledge of that, but not a practical one. On the official level, there were a lot of efforts going on there is to actually do feasibility studies, and which I was involved in some, to capitalize on the infrastructure of the settlements for the benefits of the people of Gaza. But none of that happened because it was completely one-sided and the Palestinian Authority was excluded from the whole process. So you destroyed everything. But generally, the feeling was some kind of euphoria. Probably not a conscious euphoria. It was something of an excitement with a lot of anxiety, because it's a really nice idea not to see the Jewish settlers and the army in Gaza, but the anxiety comes from two aspects. We have not experienced Gaza without occupation, especially my generation, the generations that came after. And the second one, we don't know whether Israel is going to be actually controlling us from outside, because from the beginning that was a possibility. They're going to leave Gaza, lock the door, and swallow the key, so to speak.
We would like to hear your story about living in Gaza. When did you live in Gaza, and how did you come to leave? I'm hoping you can tell us your personal story, but also your insights as a social psychologist on the trauma of living in Gaza.
My generation in general, I was born and raised in Gaza. I come from a family of refugees who came from a place near Jaffa in Palestine in 1948. So we look at ourselves as refugees, even though we're full-blown Gazans in one sense or another. But as children, my generation again, we lived our childhood in the first Intifada, and then we came to age in the second Intifada. The in-between period, the Oslo periods, as you may call it, looking back now, it feels like something of a fleeting, surreal moment. The vivid memories are of the conflict, not of the period in between. It was very short and brief, in fact. But as a Palestinian growing in Gaza, especially those who grew up or in the refugee camps, in my case, was in the beach camp in a southern Gaza city. It was on the Mediterranean. I mean, the living conditions were miserable, enriched, very miserable, in fact. But at that point, as children, we did not really know any other kind of life. We didn't really have anything to compare against, in a sense. So for me personally, as far as I remember, it was fine. But as you grow up, you see the difference. You start to see the world, and it's like, oh my God, what are we living in? That catches up with you as you grow up. And in the second Intifada, these things became like full-blown trauma, especially as the bombardment and the airstrikes started to happen. I mean, the first Intifada was more or less like clashes on the streets, and it was brutal, but it wasn't warlike brutal. But the thing is, as you live in that situation, you're always on standby, something of a coping mechanism. But when I left Gaza, all this started to emerge on the surface. It's something like a suppressed trauma, so you're outside the fight or flight situation, it comes back and bites you. This is why if you meet most Palestinians, I would say Gaza and the West Bank, even in Eastern Jerusalem, there is you would get two things from Palestinians. There are two characteristics, a cynicism and pessimism. They're mainly because the most important factor, or the most torturing factor of living under the occupation, especially in Gaza, is the lack of certainty. You don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow, because you plan, but the Israelis did plan something else. As somebody who wanted to leave Gaza to study, it was like an ambition, like a dream of mine, was to go abroad and study and basically enlighten myself. But this is my plan. Their plan may differ and will always ruin mine. So if I want to leave, I don't know whether the border going to be open tomorrow or not. In my case, it took me 60 days to leave Gaza. I went to the border back and forth, maybe 15 times, until I finally managed to climb on top of a bus and managed to get into the Israeli side and then the Egyptian side. Then I left. It was a miserable journey, but at least I took a breath and I was like, I finally got out. It's like crawling out of like a python's hole. But that gives you, it makes you as a Palestinian to always have a pessimistic view of the world. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. So what I need to do as a Palestinian in Gaza is to actually live the moment and try to be cynical about it, because otherwise it's very difficult to actually comprehend it or swallow it as a reality. You create a parallel reality and you live in it, because this is the only way you can cope with the situation. It doesn't matter if you haven't lived somewhere else and you were born into it, but it always feels unnatural, and you have to normalize it.
Can you talk about how travel restrictions are among the most incapacitating consequences of Israel's military occupation?
I think the time when I left was a lot easier than it is now, yet when that happened, it was still very difficult. I got a scholarship to study in the UK, and it took me 60-something days until I managed to get out of Gaza. I kept going back and forth to the border, and sometimes the Israelis won't give permission to Egyptians to open the border. And sometimes they say, well, technical issues, then go back. The other day, it's no, there's security issues, go back. So it's been like 60 days of back and forth. So when I got there, I basically managed to climb on top of a bus that managed to get through. It's one of the last buses, actually. And it was a dangerous situation, frankly. And then, because technically I was desperate to get out. I mean, otherwise I would lose my scholarship, which I worked hard for. And but once I got there, a security coordination in Egypt ported to the airport, so I ended up being deported to the airport, where I spent like a few days there in a filthy room with a lot of abuse and anxiety and crowdedness, and took like barely in showers or anything until I managed to catch my flight like a few days later and went to the UK. Other people had the worst experience, as in they spent, I would say weeks. I know a friend of mine on the way back from Gaza, because the border was closed, he spent in Cairo airport in that filthy room about 60 days or something. So it was a horrendous experience. Nowadays, on the other hand, it's what used to happen then when I left still happens, coupled with this increasing security threats inside Sinai and stricter Egyptian security measures against Palestinians, and also happening in the shadow of the somewhat unfriendly relationship between Hamas, the de facto ruler of Gaza now, and the Egyptian authorities. Egypt Sisi is not very friendly with the Muslim Brotherhood, of which is Hamas an offshoot. So in the middle of all that, what happens is that Palestine is squeezed in the middle, and leads to like a lot of, whether premeditated or unintentional, violations of human rights. It gets worse every day, basically. Not to mention that the border is almost always closed, especially since the COVID-19 crisis. It was open like to just let people in and out for what you call humanitarian and urgent cases, like people who want to have like critical medical conditions and do you want to go to Egypt, to Egyptian hospitals, or those who got like citizenships from different countries or residency in different countries and who want to leave. But those are the priorities. Those who want to leave just either as to study or leisurely, these things you could probably forget about, because they're not going to happen as long as the current security procedures are in existence.
Let's talk for a minute about returning to Gaza from Cairo.
It's always been like as bad, but it is much, much worse now, mainly because of the security issues in Sinai. As you know, Egypt, at least they claim, or they appear to be fighting a war against terrorism like ISIS and the Sinai. So Sinai, the whole peninsula and its residents, Egyptian residents, under a lot of security restrictions. So it doesn't only apply to Palestinians, but also to Egyptians in the area. So Egypt has some genuine security concerns in the area. But that reflects negatively on those traveling through Sinai. I mean, mostly people from Gaza. So technically, if you're coming back from the Cairo airport and you want to cross the Suez Canal, you travel over the Mubarak Bridge, which goes over the Suez Canal, and that's like a quick access. Nowadays, because of the war on terror in Sinai, the bridge is closed, so people will have to take the ferry, and the ferry has limited capacity and has very limited frequency. So imagine the flow of cars that goes naturally through the bridge is no more, but you have lines and lines, almost extends to 2 or 3 miles of Palestinian passengers waiting for their turn to actually get on the ferry and move across the Suez Canal. It could take 2, 3, or 4, 5, 6 days. Once you cross the Suez Canal, I'm assuming that happened, you have to go through, I would say, tens of security checkpoints, all the way to Rafah, which is the southern part of Gaza, with the border with Gaza. There are a lot of restrictions. You're not allowed to, these days at least, as far as I know, you're not allowed to bring with you electronics, because they look at that as security concerns. And you're not allowed to bring, even electronic toys. On the other hand, we're dealing with some soldiers who are actually under a lot of pressure and really underpaid. So they actually try to embezzle a lot of money from Palestinians. The ethical questions aside, but this is how it is. I'm not actually accusing anybody here. I'm actually giving a diagnosis of what's really happening there. Because Sinai under a lot of security restrictions, the 300 or 400 kilometers trip from the Suez Canal all the way to Gaza, which usually take about 4 to 5 hours, it's cut short because of the curfew that starts at 5 o'clock in the evening. Again, security issues. So people go to Arish. Arish is the nearest Egyptian city to Gaza is about 30 kilometers away, and you have to spend the night there, and then the next day you take the taxi and then go to Gaza. So we're talking about the trip from the Cairo airport to Gaza could take from 2 to 7 days, technically, which under normal circumstances, in any other country in the world, that would take only a matter of hours.
Well, thanks for filling us in on that. I think it's an aspect of the challenges to Gazans that most of us have not been aware of. If you are just now joining us, this is KKFI Radio, Understanding Israel-Palestine, and we are talking with Dr. Emad Moussa about his experience living in Gaza and leaving to study in Great Britain. I wonder if we could switch just for a moment to subject of annexation, the possibility of Israel continuing more annexations of the occupied territories. You have written that annexation is a fateful choice that would impact both Palestinians and Israelis. And fateful choices are, to be clear, a term that a British historian introduced to describe choices politicians make when they are driven by their own internal logic, but which can ultimately backfire and lead to a country's moral or physical destruction. So how would Israel's annexation of the occupied territory be a fateful choice, and what ramifications might follow annexation?
First of all, for Israelis, there are genuine geopolitical greeds, I would say, of annexing as much Palestinian land as possible, mainly for water resources, geopolitical and strategic depth, because, the map is very narrow in the middle in a way. But on the other hand, there's a lot of psychology involved. To understand the psychology of the annexation, which leads to fateful choice, in a way, is to understand how a lot of Israelis think in terms of the Zionist mentality of victimhood, in a way. The occupation, as a term, is a very negative term. So in order to counteract this term, a lot of Israelis do pretend that as if they don't see it, or try to beautify it as to say, we were the victims, so we're justified to do whatever we want to do, or we're the victims, we deserve what we have now. Doesn't matter what other people's opinions are. That in a way that makes society like a cocoon upon itself, like detach itself from the world, at least psychologically. So it creates a continuous state of denial and illusion. On the other hand, if you try to just to use layman's term, to just shove it in the face like that, the occupation exists, you're aggressive and you're an oppressive country, they would turn to like military power, because you cannot tell them that, because that contradicts with the general idea that Jews and Zionists in Israel are victims of not only the Palestinians, but everybody else in the world. With that in mind, they try to, revert inwardly into society and cocoon upon themselves to avoid being reminded of who they actually are, as opposed to the Holocaust victims or the Jewish history of victimization. And on one hand, that increases the aggressiveness against Palestinians, because Palestinians are the reminder that they're not victims, so they want to suppress it and get rid of it. And on the other hand, it's isolation. They isolate themselves from the Palestinians. So even if they want to see the occupation for what it is, they're psychologically blocked from seeing that, because otherwise you don't want to be in the aggressor's role. Additionally, if you isolating yourself and being detached from the Palestinians, that reduces empathy. And reduces empathy increases aggressiveness, and aggressiveness increases international condemnation. And it's like a vicious cycle. And on the other hand, with that in mind, what's happening inside in Israel, if you keep that mentality going, and if you root it and if you try to heighten it, which has been like the case, especially with Benjamin Netanyahu in power and the right-wing agenda, that actually erodes society from within, not only in reference to the Palestinians, but in reference to Israeli democracy itself. We can see what Netanyahu is doing now, corruption, by sticking, just like Donald Trump now, with like trying not to leave his throne, so to speak. But generally, annexation would backfire, like I said, both geopolitically, or like international isolation, which in a way confirms to some of them that indeed the whole world is against us. It doesn't matter what we do as Israelis, but if the world stands against us because we want to annex somebody else's land, that means and confirms to us that we are still the victims. And since we're the victims, we're justified to do whatever we want to do, including annexation.
Building on those thoughts, as you say, Israel's modern identity is built on the historical trauma of the Holocaust. And through that trauma, it justifies living by the sword and in a constant state of fear. Help us understand the academic concept of a chosen trauma. The Holocaust in Israel's case is a chosen trauma, which can only be resolved through what the Turkish psychologist calls chosen glory. And simply put, part of the reason Israel annexes Palestinian lands is to fulfill its fantasies about a lost glory.
That's correct, yes. Well, chosen trauma in social psychology and political psychology, it means a certain point of time when a large trauma affected the collective, a country or a group of people, and it's carried along with them into the modern age. I mean, Van Volken, who's the one who coined the term, he started talking first in reference to the Turkish-Cypriot relationship, and then one of his best examples was what happened in Bosnia, because he said the Battle of Kosovo of 1389, when the Ottomans brought an end to Serbia, the Serbs still used this event in history 700 years ago to justify the genocide against the Muslim Albanians at that point. The same applies to people in Northern Ireland, Rwandans, and most importantly, applies heavily to the Israelis. Because not only are we talking about the Holocaust, we're talking about a major trauma, chosen trauma, built on top of like 2,000 years of a diaspora of trauma, basically. But chosen trauma is part of a triage of socio-psychological manifestation, which is chosen trauma, time collapse, and chosen glory. So when you have a point of time, when you experience a larger trauma and you carry it along to the present, it's called time collapse. So past memories are intertwined with actions and emotions pertaining to the current situation. In a way, this exaggerates the image of the current enemy and blurs the distinction between what is real and what is fantasy. One of the examples I draw sometimes is that when the Israelis go and visit Auschwitz, because they take their high school students and they take their army officers to visit Auschwitz every year. So in the lack of enemy, a physical Nazi enemy in Auschwitz, what's happening is that they project the feeling of victimhood onto the Palestinians. So when they go back, they look at Palestinians as if they're the continuation of the oppression against the Jews. So basically, Palestinians are Nazified, which they did repeatedly when the state was established in 1948 against Nasser, and they did again against Ahmadinejad of Iran. So they Nazified the Arab to justify certain agenda and to actually feel psychologically comfortable about the balance of power or lack thereof. What happens after time collapse, because it's a trauma, it's a source of shame. So what happens is you need to remedy the shame. So what you do is turn to chosen glory. Chosen glory is a way to revive the triumphs of the past, the glory of the past, to actually suppress the feeling of trauma and the shame that comes with it. Because as a traumatized person, you're a victim, and a victim supposedly is a passive subject and something done to it. So you are in the position of weakness. So this is why exactly Zionism was very selective about history. When they established the Zionist doctrine of trying to justify the immigrations to Palestine, and they tried to wipe out the diaspora Jew who was to them as a passive victim. And then after that, the Holocaust victims were considered as passive. But they would try to create a new Jew, what's called the Sabra or Tsavar in Hebrew, which means it's cactus, and it means cactus, which like a reference to tenaciousness and strength. So they want to create an identity that's opposed to anything passive about ancient Judaism or ancient Jews. In this way, they try to remodel the identity of the all Jews, which they see and perceive as weak. So this is why Israel is heavily militaristic, heavily belligerent, is an overcompensation. So this is try to actually revive the past by selecting certain triumphant events from the past. For example, they focus on the Masada, what's happened in 73 AD. I mean, it's not a very, what do you call it? I mean, the Battle of Masada, for example, was one of the least significant and least successful events in ancient Jewish history, yet it was utilized to emphasize the Jewish settlers' struggle in the pre-state Palestine. I mean, they don't mention, for example, other events when like in the fortress of Herdim in 70 AD, 3 years before Masada, or all the defenders and dead decided to surrender to the Romans. They did not commit suicide or didn't become heroes. So Zionism chooses the glorious moments in the past, apply them to the present in order to wipe out the shame that comes with trauma. Yet at the same time, it's contradictory, because while you want to be belligerent and be a new Jew who's like independent, strong, and tenacious, what's happening is that you get trapped between the overwhelming sense of victimhood and the need to be a hero. You end up contradicting yourself, and once again, you end up in a vicious cycle of you don't know where to go. Can I be a victim, or can I be a hero, or can I be a victim hero, like one of Israeli writers said?
It is a vicious cycle, and the question is how to get out of that vicious cycle. Thank you for sharing your thoughts today on Understanding Israel-Palestine and KKFI Radio. Thank you.
Thank you very much.